Hello all, and welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I go through the letters to the editor in my local newspaper, The West Australian, and criticise those people who've written in things that I think are stupid or grave abuses of logic or language. Anyway, let's get started. So, first up, Scotland and Crimea, 26th of March 2014. Could somebody explain to me why a referendum in Scotland, due to take place later this year, which provides the option for Scotland to leave the United Kingdom, is acceptable, while a referendum in Crimea to detach itself from Ukraine, now ruled by an unelected government, is a cause for outrage? W.M. Hatton, Woodlands. Well, the simple answer here is that the referendum that's taken place in Scotland is actually completely legal and in keeping with the constitutional law of the United Kingdom, whereas the referendum in Crimea was not. So to kind of understand what the issue is here, and I think I may have talked about this before, but basic idea is that the situation in Crimea differs quite significantly from Scotland in a number of factors. Firstly, it's a very sudden thing. Why is this relevant? Well, the issues of succession and leaving somewhere, leaving a part of country, leaving another country, are actually quite complicated for the people living there. And usually you're talking about fairly heterogeneous groups. So you're talking about where there will be a subset of that population who are living there who want to stay and a subset that want to leave. And so whichever way you go, some part is not going to get what they want. And so you are going to have some part of the population not having their right, not having what they want, and so you need to think through carefully how you're going to deal with that. If you don't, then you get situations like Northern Ireland, where these issues were not thought through sensibly, and as a result you've had long conflicts that were often violent and bloody and terrible for all people involved. So that's one reason. So it was very, very sudden in Crimea. The second thing is that it was taken part, as you say, under the auspices of a government that was not elected. And it did not comply, as far as I understand it, with the constitutional law of that country. That meant that not only was it potentially abusive to those people who are living there who don't want to leave, but also it wasn't even following the due processes that were supposed to protect those people. Thirdly, you had Russian soldiers there for the vote. And you did not have any kind of meaningful outside witnesses to it. And so any suspicions we had that maybe the voting wasn't free and fair were not able to be dispelled. If anything, outsiders were even more suspicious as a result of this, that the voting was not free and fair. And that's the worst kind of secession you can have, a secession where some group within the society can push through a secession that is illegal. Scotland, on the other hand, this process has been going for a long time. These issues have been widely canvassed. It's following all of the appropriate laws. And lastly, there's no suggestion that Scotland is being in any way bullied into leaving. There's no larger government. There's no Russia sitting in the background wanting to take on Scotland as part of the new thing. They're looking to leave the United Kingdom and that's it. Whereas Crimea, the vote was not to detach itself from Ukraine, as you put it, but actually to join Russia, which is another thing entirely. And also, given the sort of history of states breaking up and being amalgamated by dictators in that area of the world, and recent history, there's a lot more concern. Scotland, on the other hand, has been relatively stable, and there's been long moves towards home rule there. And so the referendum is much more in keeping with something that you can trust is probably going to represent the democratic will of most of the people living there. So there you go. Next one. Problem has 114 digits. 26th of March 2014. Why not allow voters in the Senate election to preference as many or as few candidates below the line as they desire? This would allow the vast majority of voters who do not wish to number the entirety of their ballot to retain full control of how those preferences are distributed, rather than handing them over to political parties. It is simply not possible those preferences could match what a voter would independently choose, given that the number of different ways you could preference the 77 candidates is 114 digits long. Alastair Morey, Shenton Park. I actually checked. It is 114 digits wrong, so somebody got their maths right, which is good. So some overlapping issues. So firstly, with the next letter I'm going to read. So I'm actually going to read the next letter and then I'll come back. So the next letter is a simple solution, 30th of March 2014. My politically astute Generation Y son came up with a suggestion that could resolve concern over Senate voting and simplify polling in other elections too. A box on the ballot paper would indicate, if selected, that the voter did not want their vote to go to preferences. A voter could then vote above the line, knowing their vote would not be allocated to a party other than the one selected. If left unchecked, the vote would be free to preference other parties. Don, Godwin, Karana. Okay, so we're talking about the election here, and we've been talking about it for a while, and part of the reason why I keep stirring up this stuff is that we have what seems like a fairly complicated system here in Australia and WA. So let's actually get into it. So first of all, let's actually look at the way the Senate works. So the Senate voting is different from the lower house. In that the Senate has what they call proportional representation. This is where you have multiple seats for each electorate. So the way the Senate works is that WA is treated as one electorate. So all voters in WA are voting for the same candidates. This is very different from the lower house, where WA is divided up into a large number of different electorates, each of which elect only one person. So here in WA, all of us together count as one electorate, and we elect multiple people to represent WA. This, combined with our preferential system, that is, we don't work on a first past the post system, and all votes, if the person you voted for doesn't get elected, your vote then carries through to your second, third, fourth choice, etc., etc. And with the fact that because we've got 2.5 million people in this one electorate, that leads us to have lots of different candidates. So when you have a relatively small electorate, you generally have relatively few candidates. So we have a big electorate, 2.5 million people, with preferential voting, and we elect multiple people from that. And the result is, as you rightly point out, we have 77 candidates standing. I mean, that is a lot of people. And if we were using just first past the post, then you just put a 1 next to the person you want, and that would be it. This is not... this is generally seen... This would be an appalling... The first past the post would be appalling in this situation, because what would happen is that the vote would essentially be split across 77 candidates. So you might get a bunch of Labour people in, a bunch of Liberal people in, and then you would get a whole pile of minor parties who would get far, far, far below what anybody would think would be a reasonable vote, simply because the overall vote would be split amongst the 77 candidates. And to get first past the post, you'd need relatively small amounts. I mean, for example, if you have first past the post with 3 candidates, that means that any candidate can win with only just over one third of the vote. If you have 77 candidates, then it's quite feasible for one of those candidates can get a seat with only 1/77th of the vote, right? Which is less than 2%. So first past the post is totally not going to work. So the idea that you're like is this idea that you should be able to number just those people that you want, either just a 1 and then it's kind of like first past the post, or maybe a 1, a 2, a 3, or 4 down to 10, and then just give up, and then your vote will flow down through those 10. And then if that doesn't elect anybody by that point, then we chuck it out. Now the problem is with this is that the reason we have a complicated voting system here is because that was deemed through solid thought and scholarship to be the fairest practical voting system that we could have. So it works. We can generally come out with an outcome within a couple of weeks, which is pretty damn good. And actually often we can come out with an outcome within days, which is very good for the complication of it. And it allows votes to flow down through the preferences so that you don't have the issues you have with first past the post. So a lot of thought has gone into this, and so these simplistic suggestions, on the face of it, we should be a bit skeptical. And so I'll explain to you why it wouldn't work at all. So let's look at or at least we couldn't do it by incorporating it into the current system. So the way the current system works is that they lump all the votes based on their first preference. And to get a seat, somebody must get enough votes to be a quota. And so the idea there is that if there's 6 senators from WA, then to get a quota, you need to have at least 1/6 of the vote. So they look at who's got the most, and they go, okay, you've got your 1/6. We'll take 1/6. We'll take enough votes to get you elected and put them aside. They're done. Those people voted for you and you got in. And anything that's left over, we're going to spread out amongst all the other candidates according to the preferences on those, right? And then so then it goes down to the next person. We look at the next highest lump. Have they got 1/6? If they don't, if at some point they don't, then what we do is we take the smallest number, a party that's the person who's got the smallest number of votes, and we eliminate them and say they can't possibly get in. We take their votes and we distribute them according to the preferences until one person gets enough to get in. They get over the 1/6. We put once their votes aside, we take the excess that wasn't needed to elect them, we distribute them according to preferences. And so the whole process works on being able to cut somebody out, either because they got elected or because they didn't get enough votes, and distribute their vote, the leftover votes, according to the preferences. Now, what happens if we allow one of these systems where there are some of those votes don't have additional preferences? What do we do then? Well, you would say, we just throw those votes away. We put them on the side and we say, well, they don't count anymore because you've exhausted all the preferences that person has left. The problem with that is you've removed votes from the system, and therefore the quotas will change, because the quota is defined as 1/6 of the votes that are cast. So if now, at some point, if we count down and we go, now we've got to exclude all of these votes because they no longer have preferences listed, do we go back and distribute some out of these people who've already been elected based on a quota that's now too high? And in doing so, you've got some rather complicated issues there about how that's going to interplay, because then if the drops down a bit, then maybe one of those people who you've eliminated shouldn't be eliminated anymore, and then you'll have to somehow take their votes back in. All in all, these issues have been thought about, and they've been thought about a lot. People are very interested in electoral theories and electoral systems, and so the short answer is it's not going to work in this current system. You would actually have to overhaul a lot of the system to get rid of it. And basically you'd have to give up a lot of the things that we think are very valuable in the system. That is proportional representation, so every vote has the same value. That's important. The idea, so in the Senate, that smaller parties that have a significant but minor level of support should still be able to get people in. So that's the way the Senate works. So despite the Greens consistently polling 10%, 12% throughout their long history, they've never gotten anybody into the lower house before I think the last election or the one before that. This didn't make sense because you've got about 150 seats in the lower house, and if 10% of people want a Greens MP, then you should have at least 1.5 seats, give or take. But due to the way that the lower house, the electorates work in the lower house, they only recently managed to get one in. In the upper house, they managed to get roughly 10% of the senators have been Green senators because it represents the will of the people a bit more accurately. So you'd have to do away with possibly that if you went to your system. The other thing you might have to do away with is the idea of being able to, your vote is not wasted if you vote for somebody who doesn't get in. The reason we have preferential voting is to encourage and support voting for parties even when we can be fairly sure that they won't get in, because that leads to situations where we can be not so sure that they won't get in, which may then lead to situations where they might get in. As soon as you have a first past the post or something similar like that, which actually is what you're advocating, you're suggesting moving back towards first past the post, then what you end up with is entrenching the power of the dominant parties. Now, if you're a dominant party kind of person, you'd say that's good, but generally as an electorate we don't like that, because by allowing minor parties to threaten the major parties, it means that the major parties actually have to take notice of what people want. So when people are dissatisfied, what we saw with the rise of One Nation is people were dissatisfied with the way that the government were going. They all started voting, well, a significant chunk of people started voting for One Nation, and as a result, the Liberal Party had to take on board those disgruntled people's concerns and actually incorporate them into policy platforms. So actually, part of the reason why first past the post is not preferred here is because it does actually lead to portions of the electorate being disenfranchised, essentially. Or at least the major parties don't have to appeal to them anymore. So all in all, here's my little thing. If you're suggesting a way of changing the electoral system, the question to ask yourself is, do I know what Arrow's theorem is? And if the answer is no, then you are in no position to suggest changes to the electoral system. If your answer is yes, then please bring it on. Okay, next letter. This is not Imperial. 27th of March 2014. The new titles Dame and Knight will clearly be part of an Australian honours system, but they are not Imperial honours. They will not be bestowed by the Queen as the Empress of the British Empire. They will be bestowed by her in her separate role and title as Queen of Australia. Andrew Birch, Victoria Park. And in which you have... I almost thought that this must be tongue-in-cheek, but it isn't. You have completely made the point. The fact that Queen Elizabeth II is the Queen of Australia, and that the names and knights will be bestowed by her. The opposition to it is that it's harkening back to seeing Australia as being little more than a British colony. And the argument that, oh, it's okay because she is the Queen of England, but she's also the Queen of Australia in a different role, hardly satisfies those of us who are Republicans, that this is somehow an independent Australian thing. A fix for gridlock, 31st of March 2014. Here are 2 ideas to reduce traffic congestion in Perth. Lights key to traffic chaos, 29th of the 3rd. First, ban right turns from highways and major roads and less controlled by traffic lights, especially at peak times. Second, have more flexible start and finish times for office workers, such as public servants, to ease pressure on roads. John Horner, Hamilton Hill. Okay, so similar to the whole electoral system thing, it would be a little bit naive to think that nobody's given some really deep thought to traffic congestion, and if you think about taking right turns off highways and major roads, you will have noticed that over the last couple of decades at least, there has been a significant push to ban these, in the sense that lots of these major roads now have median strips that prevent the turning of right, they have right turn lanes that prevent the congestion that comes from turning right, and there's been a push to move people onto more arterial routes where they have this sort of right turn control stuff going on. And secondly, this idea of flexible start and finish times for office workers. This is a great idea. Part of the issue with roads is that roads are significantly underused outside of peak times, and so we have to build infrastructure to support our peak time usage when that's actually only a relatively small amount of time compared to all of the off-peak where the roads the infrastructure sits there underutilized. So it's a good idea, but that is actually a massive social change. You're talking about a little bit of like, oh yeah, we can do this public servants, but actually the vast majority of people are not public servants. They work in private industry. Private industry follows the whims of things like consumers, linking in with other offices, etc., and they need to be there when everybody else is there, and they need to be there when the consumers want them to be there, etc. And so what you're talking about is a massive social change, and there's been a push for this, but it's slow going, and it seems unlikely to be much of an impact on traffic congestion anytime soon. I think a better solution would actually be to look at our school kids and the times that they are at school, because you may not have noticed, but actually during school holidays, traffic congestion actually drops off noticeably. Not a huge amount, but noticeably, because there isn't people making the same school run, depending on where you live. And so you could look at doing school times, because that's something you could mandate a change on, sort of from above, and get overnight sort of success for large numbers of people. But then there's all sorts of other issues. Now, the reason I also want to talk about this letter is not the stupidity of it, because it's actually not a particularly stupid letter, but it's representative of a large number of these letters that I've read and these suggestions about traffic congestion. And they are based on a very false premise. They're based on this idea that our road usage is very inefficient as a result of things like traffic light usage or things like this, or the times we use it. And that if we could make our usage more efficient, that would significantly reduce congestion. Now, that seems reasonable, but it is basically incorrect. And to see why, so the places where you get some of the worst traffic congestion, and it is fairly symptomatic of the rest, is on the freeways here. We only have very few freeways. In particular, if we think about Freeway North has been a car park during peak hour for basically as long as I can remember. So at least the last 20 years or so. And it has been repeatedly widened, improved, etc. They put a train line up the middle of it, so you've got good public transport alternatives, and yet it is still basically a car park during peak hours. And so the question is, why is this? Well, it's actually an issue of supply and demand. So the train is probably the best example of how this works. So when somebody who lives in a northern suburb somewhere close to the freeway has to lives there and works in the city, which is a significant number of people, then they need to get there, and basically the freeway is the main way to go there. Even though the congestion is terrible, it's still better than a lot of the alternative routes. So the question is, really their choice is between, how am I going to get there? Am I going to take public transport, or am I going to drive? And that's the question. And now for each individual who makes that choice, there is a point whereby the traffic gets so bad that it's more inconvenient to drive than it is to catch public transport, and at which point they will switch. Okay? So at this point in time, there'll be all sorts of people who are catching the train because they find that the inconvenience of catching the train is slightly better than the inconvenience of driving. Now, what will happen if we expand the roads, or we improve the traffic lights, or we stop there being right turns, or we have flexible start-finish times and we take 1,000 workers off the road, right? Is that traffic congestion will drop down. And then those people who were there's a number of people who are catching the train because traffic congestion was too bad for them, will now look at the traffic congestion and say, well, actually it's gotten better, maybe I'll drive. And so what you have is a shift of people from public transport back onto the roads to bring the congestion back up to the point where you will then again have people going, oh, it's still, it's on par with my thing. And so there's this equilibrium you have between the road congestion and the public transport horribleness. Public transport is inherently inconvenient. And so the only real solution to taking people up to improving congestion, well, one of the real problems you have is that you're always competing with public transport. It doesn't matter what the congestion is. If you improve the road congestion, you will just entice people off public transport to compensate until your traffic congestion is bad again. So the only long-term solution actually is to embrace congestion, because congestion forces people onto public transport. Not forces, but it incentivizes public transport. And so when you look at things like Elizabeth Key in that kind of mentality, and there was another letter that I didn't read about how traffic lights off in some places go to red all the way around so that people can cross diagonally across the traffic lights, in the central city mainly. These are actually good things because they make it inconvenient for car drivers, and we should. As a society, we should be moving away from car use for a whole pile of reasons, not least because it's expensive as a society. It's actually cheaper to do public transport. It's cheaper not to build roads. It's cheaper not to subsidise people's petrol purchases, etc., etc. But it's also better for the environment, and it's better socially as well. If you can't drive into the city, you're more likely to look for jobs near your house, and then therefore drive less, etc., etc. So we actually, as a community, it is actually better to have inconvenience in our driving, because that encourages us to make better decisions about our transport. And so really the solution to traffic congestion isn't to get rid of it, it's actually to allow it to happen. I mean, sure, we do want, everybody wants it to be as efficient as it possibly can be within the rules. But it's generally not the utopia of having an open freeway to yourself during peak hour. One, will never happen, because if it's available for you, it's available for everybody else. But secondly, even if it did happen, that's a bloody waste of a freeway, and you're still better off on the train. There you go. Lastly, the GM debate, 1st of April 2014. Governor Malcolm McCusker decides not to grow genetically modified canola because of its lower price compared with non-GM canola. Governor rues decline of farmers, 29th of the 3rd. This surely should ring alarm bells about what the price difference actually means. To spell it out, the price for GM canola is lower because there is less market acceptance, and despite Mr. McCusker not having seen any evidence that GM canola is detrimental to our health, there are many people who believe otherwise. Janet Grogan, Karanup. I almost thought that this was a pro-GM letter, but I think you are suggesting that the many people who believe otherwise are actually correct. And here's the thing, they're wrong. Firstly, the idea between GM canola and non-GM canola is a little bit specious, because canola itself is a genetically modified version of rapeseed. Now, it's not GM in the sense that you're thinking of this whole Frankenfood stuff, and it was modified using what you might call traditional methods of genetic modification. But essentially, all canola is specifically genetically modified by people. But secondly, yeah, there is a price difference, and yes, GM canola is cheaper. This is one of the advantages of GM canola to some extent. So some of that price difference, there's two factors. Firstly, GM canola is likely to be easier to grow because you don't have such rigorous concerns about not letting it be contaminated, etc. And secondly, it should be more productive. So the whole part of the reason why we genetically modified crops is to increase their yield. So if you have an increased yield, generally that means you can produce more for the same inputs, which means that will bring the price down. So yeah, it's cheaper, and that is sometimes a good thing. Secondly, another part of the price difference is, yeah, there are consumers who don't like it. There are companies that will avoid it because they don't want to have, because they know that consumers don't like it. And in this case, as with some other cases, but not all, the consumers are dead wrong. And this is part of the organic lobby, if you like, or and the misinformation that's been spread about GM foods is that, as Mr. McCusker is right, this stuff has been around for decades. There has been incredibly rigorous studies of it. There is no reason to think that it's bad for our health. And while the argument that we don't have enough evidence was reasonable once upon a time, it no longer is. Especially in a world, here's the thing, is I actually think it's unethical to be anti-GM. And here's why, is that as a society, we struggle to as a world, we struggle to feed all of the people we have. And we should always be looking for cheaper and more efficient ways of producing, sustainably producing food. And so to rule out a particular class of food based on no good evidence, and I say that again, no good evidence. If there was good evidence, then people would take it on board. And whenever there has been evidence that there is something harmful about GM, those foods have been removed from the market. Unfortunately, other foods have also been removed from the market, and anti-GM people actually disrupt the research that would show whether or not something is safe. And so if it's a little disingenuous to say, well, we don't have enough evidence that GM stuff, whether it's safe or not, but at the same time we're going to disrupt trials to see whether it is safe or not. That aside, so if we need to feed lots of people, we need to do it as efficiently as possible. And if we could increase the yields of our crops so that we can use less land to support the same number of people, and that land use is then freed up for other more sustainable things, or perhaps we're growing more food for poor starving African orphans, I don't know, then it is unethical for us to insist on not doing that, purely because we don't like the idea of GM. So I actually think that, yeah, the price is lower, and in some ways that's a good thing, and in some ways that's just the stupidity of consumers who've been conned by an anti-GM lobby. Anyway, that's enough from me for this week. I hope you've all enjoyed hearing me rant, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.